I like visitors as much as the next Hobbit. But I do like to know them before they come visiting.
Mr. Baggins?
At your service.
So, this is the Hobbit.
You asked me to find the 14th member of this company, and I have chosen Mr. Baggins.
Me? No.
We will seize this chance to take back Erebor!
Here, Mr. Bilbo! Where are you off to?
I'm going on an adventure!
I think I read somewhere that Tolkien wrote The Hobbit as a children's book for his own children who were young at the time, and so it has a slightly naive but very whimsical and humorous kind of tone.
These swords were made for the goblin wars of the French.
I wouldn't bother, laddie. Swords are named for the great deeds they do in war.
What are you saying? My sword hasn't seen battle?
No, actually, sure, it is a sword. More of a letter opener, really.
I didn't want to make a children's film per se, but at the same time I wanted to have it more comedic than The Lord of the Rings and be able to sort of capture something of the flavour, but also feel like we had a foot in the Lord of the Rings door as well. So the same filmmakers are making another Middle-earth story in much the same style. So it's the characters within the story that give it its humour rather than me making a film for children.
If this is some plothead's idea of a joke, I can only say it is in very poor taste.
You know, if you were writing The Hobbit as an original screenplay, for instance, you wouldn't have 13 dwarves. You'd probably have 3 or 4 of them and call it a day. For a long time, I was worried about those 13 dwarves. I was worried about the size of the ensemble. But you end up having to somehow make it work for you. You know, what you think is a disadvantage has to become an advantage.
Action!
Rather than be thinking of it as the burden of having to tell a story with, you know, these 13 dwarf characters, we started to think, well, 13's not enough. I mean, what are these dwarves trying to do? They're trying to reclaim their homeland from a dragon. They really need an army.
Shut your mouth!
I mean, they need thousands of dwarves to be able to do that. So the fact that there's such a small group, you know, we sort of started to work that into the bones of the way we were telling the story.
Was that a wolf? Are there wolves out there?
Wolves? No, that is not a wolf.
It does provide a challenge. You know, all the dwarves had logistical problems with their prosthetics, so they had to have makeup on for 2 or 3 hours a day. And I mean, they had to sit in the chair for 2 or 3 hours before they could actually go on set, and they had these heavy costumes, hot, fat suits, big boots. And we knew that once we started working with these dwarves, it was going to need to go very smoothly, otherwise we were going to be in trouble. So we were reluctant to make that our very first day of shooting. So we started shooting Riddles in the Dark at the very beginning, which was just the 2 characters.
What is it, precious? What is it?
My name is Bilbo Baggins.
Bagginses. What is Bagginses, precious?
It is one of the most iconic sequences from the book. If not the most famous chapter of all, really, Riddles in the Dark. And so, you know, we decided to not try to give it too much of a, not try to speed through it too much. I mean, the scene itself is some, you know, 10 or 12 minutes long, because I wanted it to be, you know, a memorable scene in the movie as it is in the book.
I don't want any trouble, you understand? Just show me the way to get out of here, and I'll be on my way.
Oh, we know safe paths for hobbitses. Safe paths in the dark. Shut up!
I didn't say anything.
I wasn't talking to you.
I also like the idea that it allowed Andy and Martin just to sort of to help break us into the fact that we were now beginning another 18-month shoot of these 3 movies. And also allowed Martin time to find the character of Bilbo Baggins. I mean, you're literally, when you watch that scene, you're watching him figure out who this character he's playing is.
Why don't we have a game of riddles?
And if it loses, what then? Well, if it loses, precious, then we eats it. If Baggins loses, we eats it whole.
Fair enough.
The technology of Gollum has certainly advanced in the last 10 years. I mean, we still have Andy Serkis performing and doing as great a job as ever. But in the Lord of the Rings days, performance capture was really something we were almost inventing it as we were going along. It was something that was was nothing really established for how you do that, and so we did the best we could. But in The Hobbit, it got a lot better because the digital version of Gollum had a lot more muscles around his eyes and mouth and his face. Very, very subtle muscles that would allow everything that Andy did as an actor to be accurately translated. Every tiny nuance that Andy was performing on set with Martin was being captured by multiple cameras around the set, which was all this information fed into a computer, and Andy's performance was totally driving the digital Gollum.
The dark part has found a way back into the world.
Well, I always tend to struggle to keep films short for some reason. I have been guilty of making films over 2.5 hours long, generally speaking. So I don't know. It must be part of a natural style, and we did have a lot more material than just The Hobbit. We had a bunch of material that Tolkien had developed much later in his life.
Oh.
He was about 100 pages of material in the appendix of The Lord of the Rings, the Return of the King in particular, the Becker Return of the King, that relates to events around The Hobbit. So we were able to use a lot of that material and flesh it out.
Incineration.
Oh, aye, I'll melt the flesh off your bones in the blink of an eye.
Nope.
We did certainly want to apply the same storytelling style that we had used in The Lord of the Rings to The Hobbit, and because it's written as a children's book at such a breakneck pace, Tolkien doesn't really stop to do much character development or character conflict or deepening the story or the characters within the pages of The Hobbit. It's not really there. So once you start adding that material as screenwriters, you kind of, you'd be leaving a lot of iconic moments out of the book if you had to shorten it.
Cut the ropes!
I mean, every movie's a challenge. I don't think you ever have a comfort zone when it comes to being a filmmaker. I certainly haven't struck one yet, because you're spending a lot of somebody else's money, and it's a risk and a gamble. And there's two things. I mean, you want to obviously you want to make sure that whoever's paying for the movie gets their money back, because it's your career depends on it. Otherwise, you're not going to get to make many more films. But at the same time, I'm in the entertainment business, and I regard myself as an entertainer much more than an artist. And so I want to make sure that the film I make gives people a good cinema experience. They're paying their money. They have a certain expectation of what they're going to receive for that. And just want to make a good escapist adventure movie.
Home is now behind you. The world is ahead.
Look, I'm a kid who grew up loving Ray Harryhausen's movies, loving King Kong, and loving the escapism of fantasy cinema, and dreaming of doing these sorts of films. And somehow I've ended up with this enormous toy box. I've got this playground that I can just dip into. I'm very, very lucky. And plus, I'm glad I'm making films now and not 40 or 50 years ago. I'm glad I didn't have to have the limitations that Ray Harryhausen or Willis O'Brien had in their movies. I'm so glad that anything I can imagine now, and obviously a lot of it's inspired by what Tolkien writes and describes, your imagination goes into overboard, and just about anything you can come up with in your head you can put on screen now. There's no limitations anymore. So it's a really exciting time to be a filmmaker, a terrific time.